this onslaught, we need all the help we can get. We can't say the Lenten prayer too many times. For Ancient Faith Radio, this is Father Lawrence Farley.
That was No Other Foundation with Father Lawrence Farley. Father Lawrence is the pastor of St. Herman of Alaska Orthodox Church in Langley, British Columbia, and the author of numerous books and articles. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
Christ is in our midst. He is and ever shall be. You're listening to Ancient Faith Radio, timeless Christianity 24 hours a day. Hi, this is John Maddox. You know, when you support Ancient Faith Radio, you're not only helping to make this ministry possible for you, but also for people like Bryce in Australia.
I'd firstly just like to say that I love your show and what you do. It means a lot to all of us listening. I'm down in Australia, and over here, orthodoxy is basically unheard of. I'm not Orthodox. I was raised into an evangelical Protestant family. However, from a gradual exposure and desire to learn more about orthodoxy, I've come to agree and see truth in pretty much everything the church teaches. The nearest English-speaking Orthodox church is several hours away, and I feel all alone in my pursuit of the faith here. Currently, my only exposure to orthodoxy is through Ancient Faith Radio and my friend. How should I introduce the idea that I may be inquiring into orthodoxy to my parents? Thanks again, Bryce.
Would you consider a donation to AFR right now? You can do so on our app or go to our website at ancientfaith.com/support. Ancient Faith Radio, here for you and for people all over the world.
Boldly proclaiming the truth of the risen Christ. This is Ancient Faith Radio, timeless Christianity, 24 hours a day.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeanne Constantino. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeanne Constantino.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Welcome, dear brothers and sisters, to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeanne Constantino, and today is April 4th, 2022, and we are in the middle of discussing my newest book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. And my goodness, it's been really great getting out this Lent and meeting so many of you. I've been traveling quite a bit. There's only one more place I'm going to go to this Lent, and that is Kansas City. This coming weekend, I will be in Kansas City, Missouri, at the Church of the Annunciation, the Greek Orthodox Church of the Annunciation, to talk about this subject, the crucifixion of the King of Glory. And so if you're interested in attending that, as usual, that's offered by Philoptochos. So I'm not sure who you would contact for that, to attend that. I will be attending there. I'll be there on Friday night after the salutations, give a few introductory remarks. Then afterwards, most of it's going to be on Saturday during the day. If you're interested in attending that, you should, as always, contact the parish and let them know that you're coming so they can make appropriate plans, okay? And then this past weekend, I was at the wonderful parish of St. John the Theologian in Shirley, New York. Many thanks to Father Jonathan Ivanov and the parish there in Shirley. We had a beautiful time there. I got to sing with Robert, the choir director, and some choir members on Saturday at the Divine Liturgy there. It was really, really great. And a couple, lovely young couple with two little kids came all the way from St. Tikhon's to join us at that retreat. Then earlier in the week, on Wednesday night, I was in Flushing, New York, at the parish of my spiritual father, Paul Palesti, which was St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Shrine Church in Flushing. And another lovely young couple came all the way from Philadelphia through traffic to join us that night as we talked about the King of Glory. So that was really, really special. So thank you to everybody who made those things possible and those events possible. And by the way, the real heroes, as far as I'm concerned, are my husband, Father Costa, and my son, Christopher, who, when I go away for these long weekends, they look after my father. And they are really the ones who are the heroes in all of this, if you ask me. So many of you are there at home with caring for a spouse or for elderly parents or for young children. And you can't attend these things. And that's why we have a program like this. Many of these presentations that I made, by the way, are available. Very often the parishes record them and post them. So you could look into that. But you're listening to this podcast maybe because you can't get away easily and attend these presentations. So I want you to know that your work is very, very important when you're a caregiver, either for the elderly, for the sick, for young children. I have a lot of respect for that. And I can't do what I do if it weren't for Father Costa and Christopher, who steps in over these weekends to come and help with my dad. So believe me, I have a lot of respect for what you do, even though the rest of the world doesn't always appreciate how difficult it is, what it is that you do. At any rate, last week, we're back with you live. Did you notice we had everything? We had the music came down. Thank you, Trudy, for being in the studio. For the other reason, the other real heroes here are the people at AFR who make all of this possible. So last week, even though we had a live program, there were limitations on it because of the recent flooding in the studios. There was a lot of carpet that had to be replaced and equipment that had to be replaced. And because of that, even though they were able to maneuver technically the program so that I could come to you live, and they had the starting music, there were no breaks because they couldn't do that. I don't understand all the engineering and all the technical aspects of it. They couldn't break, and so I talked for an hour and a half, and I went over. And because of the fact that there was no one in the studio, the program cut off before I was finished, and I was informed of this later. So I didn't realize that it was on a timer and that I had to end by a certain time. So we didn't quite finish everything. The program ended in the middle. And so my understanding is that they ended when I was talking about hypovolemic shock, maybe the last few minutes when we were talking about the cause of death of Christ. So I'll just sort of try to cover that very, very briefly before we go on to our real subject matter for this evening. And by the way, I noticed somebody gave a lower evaluation of the book. Somebody wrote a review, and they didn't like the fact that I talked about the physical death of Jesus. And that's okay. I mean, a person is entitled to their opinion and give whatever review they want on the book. So far, it's been getting 5 stars, except for this one person who gave it 4 stars because they didn't approve of the fact that I talked about the physical death of Christ. So let me say one thing about that. First of all, I did say in the book that Jesus Christ could not have to, Jesus Christ really did not have to die because he was not subject to physical death, right? He was sinless, so he really was not subject to death. He decided to die. He allowed himself to die, you see. So I did mention that theologically speaking, we cannot speak of a physical cause of death. However, as a human person, Jesus suffered as much as any one of us would have suffered in the body. And I think it's important that we talk about that. Some people don't like to read about that. And I believe I talked about that last time in the podcast. They don't want to hear about these things, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the physical suffering of the Lord, and it's very important that we acknowledge his physical death, even if we can't point to one particular thing that was the cause of death, and theologically speaking, he allowed himself to die. This is why he died. But people do discuss physical causes of death by crucifixion, and there are numerous books and articles that talk about the physical death of Jesus Christ. So I felt that it was important to address that in the book and to talk to you about it. So why is it important that we talk about the physical death of Jesus Christ? It's important that we talk about the physical death of Christ because it was a big heresy in the early church. The first really serious heresy of the early church was a heresy that denied the humanity of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that was a heresy that denied the humanity of Jesus Christ. So there was this heresy that Jesus only seemed to be human. And this heresy was called Docetism. The church responded to this heresy. The church responded to the heresy of Docetism. And that was, it's amazing, actually, the first real heresy that the church faced was the heresy that the Lord only seemed to be human. He didn't have a real human body, you see. This was the heresy. And so today, that's hard for us to imagine. You see, it's hard for us to imagine a time when the church had to fight for the humanity of Christ, because today it is the opposite. You see, today we have to fight for people to believe in the divinity of Christ. You see what I mean? So, because we can't even imagine a time when people did not believe that Jesus was human, but only believed that he was God. I think it's important for us to recognize that, the full humanity of the Lord. So I have had people say to me, well, why was Jesus afraid at Golgotha? Why did he pray that the cup be taken away from him? And I said, because he didn't want to suffer. He didn't want to die. Yeah, but he is God. They seem to forget the full humanity of Christ. So the church always felt that it was very, very important to acknowledge the full humanity of Christ. So that's why I think it's important to talk about that. So let's get to the fact that, so what did I talk about last time? So the main theories about the cause of death of Jesus was asphyxia. That was he couldn't breathe properly. I think I covered that. I think that was discussed. The other one was heart attack or ruptured heart. I discussed that very briefly because that's not the main one. And the last one is shock. So hypovolemic shock comes about when there's low blood fluids. And it is very possible that Jesus had very low blood fluid and low bodily fluids because of the fact that he was dehydrated and he had lost a lot of blood. And this affects the ability of the body to circulate blood, also because of the fact that he was upright on the cross, you see, and his legs were bent. And so when you're not moving, when you're on a long a long plane ride, it's good to get up and walk around because, it's important that the blood circulate. The blood circulating is what brings oxygen to the body, to the vital organs of the body. And so it would have been difficult if he already had low blood volume, low fluids. That's called hypovolemia, when you have low fluids. That it's very difficult for the heart to pump the blood through the body and bring oxygen to the muscles and to the organs of the body. So this may have contributed to a physical cause of death of people who were crucified, and also traumatic shock, the simple loss of blood and the shock to the system of what the body had been through. So what I concluded by saying is that we really cannot point to one cause of death of Jesus Christ, even if there was a physical cause of death, or of people in general when they were crucified. We can't point to one thing because many different factors contributed to death by crucifixion. So that's how I ended it. So let's move on. If you want to see in more detail how I explain this, you can look at the book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, and I discuss this. So now we're going to move on to the final words of the Lord and other events that took place on the cross while he was on the cross. And as usual, I cannot go into tremendous detail with any of these if we are going to finish within an hour and 15 minutes, which is what we have left. So one of the things that we see after the Lord was nailed up and he was raised up on the upright beam, hanging from the upright beam, and placed on, he was hanging from the cross beam and then lifted up to the upright beam, which was then attached. He was lifted up on the cross beam. He was hanging from the cross beam. And then he and his cross beam were lifted up and dropped down onto the upright beam. So now and then his feet were affixed to the upright beam. Okay, so I'm sorry I mangled that. And then the titulus stating the crime was nailed to the top of the upright beam. Now Jesus and his feet were nailed to the upright beam. Now he was completely crucified. So now at this point, the work of the soldiers was done and they could relax, so to speak, and just wait for him and the other two criminals to die. All right. So one of the things that they did after affixing the titulus to the upright beam, and the titulus is the placard that stated the crime, and that said Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Then what they could do, now that the work was done of crucifying these three people who had been given to this detail of 5 soldiers to take care of this aspect of one of their duties, now they gambled for the clothing. And our word confiscate comes from the Latin word confiscare, which is to assign or transfer to the fiscus. So one of the things that happened when a person was sentenced to death by the Roman state is that they lost all of their property. Everything that they owned was confiscated by the state. So confiscare means confiscare was to consign or to transfer to the fiscus. The fiscus was the state treasury. When it was a wealthy person who died, who was sentenced to death, and the state confiscated literally everything they owned, this left the family impoverished. Now, Jesus didn't own any property except for his clothing. So this is what was taken. Now, the Roman state would not have been interested in Jesus's clothing. So the soldiers got to keep it, okay? And so the only thing that was left really was his clothing, and that was fabric, however, and you might think, well, who would want somebody's clothes? Well, fabric was very, very expensive. We don't think about that today because our fabric is usually made by machines, and that was a big innovation in the Industrial Revolution. Remember that you learned about back in high school when you learned about the Industrial Revolution that started in England in the 1800s, and then it went to America and other Western countries. When there was an Industrial Revolution and many things were mechanized that previously had been done by hand, one of the first things was the production of cloth. And that was a big deal because that was a very time-consuming process. So once they developed machines that could make cloth by machine, that was a tremendous advancement. And then all of a sudden, clothing became much less expensive. But prior to that, everything had to be made by hand, from the shearing of the sheep to the carding of the wool to the spinning of the yarn, to the putting it on a loom and dyeing it and cutting it and sewing it. Everything was done by hand. So in the 1800s, when all of this was automated, all of a sudden cloth became very inexpensive, which is why clothing is inexpensive today. But back in the time of the Roman Empire, cloth was very time-consuming to produce, and even the smallest scrap of cloth was something that people saved and could use for various things that we usually think of today as being performed by paper. So there was paper. We have paper products. Even today, you blow your nose and you use a Kleenex and you throw it away. It wasn't that long ago the people carried handkerchiefs around, right? And then you washed your handkerchief and you reused it. So many, many things that we think of as disposable, paper towels, things like this, vamvaki, like cotton or something that we might use to cushion a wound or to wrap, you have a leg or a knee that is strained and you wrap a piece of something disposable around it. You couldn't do that. A wound, to dress a wound with something that we now dispose of. That's why we have landfills that are bursting at the seams, because so many things today are disposable. That wasn't the case in antiquity. Every little bit of cloth was useful and valuable. So the Roman soldiers took Jesus's clothes and they divided it up amongst themselves. That was sort of like a little perk, a little bonus that they got for doing this job. So what type of clothing would Jesus have had? He would have had his sandals, a head covering probably, a cloth belt or a sash, his tunic, which was the main piece of clothing, his underwear, of course, which we know he was wearing on the cross, because prisoners were not crucified naked in Judea, at least, and maybe other parts of the empire also if they were Jewish, especially in places that had a large Jewish population like Alexandria or Babylon. They still might have had that, probably observed that custom, okay, that Jewish prisoners were not crucified naked. But also, besides his tunic, his mantle, okay? So those were the main things, pieces of clothing. And the one we know about is the tunic, and I'm sure that they divided the mantle. The mantle was the large piece of clothing that you see in Bible movies or in pictures or paintings. They're wearing this piece, let's go back a minute. The tunic, which was the main piece of clothing, was basically identical for men and women. Okay, it had an opening for the neck, it had long sleeves, it went all the way down to the ankles. Okay, that's called the tunic. Some people call it the robe, but it's the main piece of clothing that both men and women had. And they also had a cloth belt, like a sash, okay, that they would tie around their waist. So that's what people wore every day. And men and women had the same basic type of garment. So if you wanted to do work, like work out in the field, you would shorten it. You would take your cloth belt and you would make it tighter. You would tie it tighter around you, and then you would pull up the garment so that it would hang over the belt. And that's how you could work more easily. Let's say you would raise your garment so that your knees were exposed. Men would do that. I don't know if women did that. Probably not. But this is why the Bible says sometimes, gird your loins. What that meant, or it talks about the girdle of a man. What they meant was this belt, this cloth sash that they would tighten. Gird your loins, it meant get ready for work, okay? It meant tighten your belt, get ready for work, because this is what a man would do. He would tighten his belt, then he would pull up on the lower part of the garment so that it would hang over the belt and he could work. Okay, this is what that meant. All right. So this is the main garment. And in Christ's case, it was seamless. So we're going to get to that in a moment. So that's the main garment. But the really valuable garment was the mantle. Ordinarily, for most people, it was the mantle, which was a very long rectangular piece of fabric. It was made of wool. And for a Jewish man, on the four corners, there was a tassel. They were called it tzitzit. And that's one of my favorite words to say, tzitzit. So there were 4 tassels on Jesus's mantle, like all Jewish men had 4 tassels. And the tassels represented the commandments of the law. And this garment was draped over one shoulder and came back around the other side of the shoulder. It hung diagonally across the body, and everybody wore it. So when you traveled, you took your mantle with you, and that was both your coat and your blanket at night, okay? And that's what the woman with the hemorrhage was trying to touch. She was trying to touch Jesus' tzitzit, the little tassel, one of the tassels that was hanging from the 4 corners of his mantle, all right? But that's not the thing that they were gambling for, even though it was considered very valuable. Okay, the mantle was a large piece of cloth. And if a person was I read about a married couple that was so poor, they only had one mantle between them. Okay, so that was considered an expensive piece of clothing, but it could easily be divided by the soldiers. The more expensive piece was Jesus's tunic, in this case only. Ordinarily, a tunic had a seam or more than one seam. You know, you would sew on, just like today, if you know anything about sewing, you can look at your garment, what you're wearing right now. Usually the shoulder, you know, the sleeves are separated from the rest of the garment. You have at least 2 seams on the sides of a garment, at least. Jesus's garment, Jesus's tunic, his robe had no seams at all. And that's what made it very valuable. But we will also talk about what made that important, what made that, what could I say? What made it theologically important, okay? So the soldiers cast lots for this piece of clothing. The mantle, even though ordinarily for most Jews, that was the most expensive piece of clothing because it was a long piece of wool that served as a blanket at night. For most Jews, that was the most expensive piece of clothing because, as a matter of fact, it was so valuable that for many Jews, that was, I'm going back now, I'm talking about the mantle, his cloak, sometimes that's translated as his cloak. For most Jews, their cloak or their mantle, this very, very wide piece of woolen cloth that was both a coat and a blanket, that was the most valuable piece of clothing that they owned. That's what they needed to wrap around themselves when they slept at night. It was a matter of Jewish law that if somebody needed to give you collateral for a loan, you could accept their mantle because that was the only object of value that they had. But you had to give it back to them every night. So if you loaned someone in the village some money, you could take their mantle as collateral, but every night they could come to your house and ask for their mantle. Otherwise, they would be cold at night. This is in the Bible, okay? So the mantle was ordinarily the most valuable piece of property a typical person had. So Jesus had a mantle, yes, but that was not more valuable than his tunic, his robe, as it's sometimes translated, okay? So why was his robe so valuable, his tunic? It's because it had no seam. Now, I see that we have reached the end of, we've come to the first half hour, and I'm going to stop at this moment so we can pick it up later, and I want to talk to you about what it meant that he had a seamless robe, all right, and how it's possible that a robe could even be seamless, all right? So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantino will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
New from Ancient Faith Publishing.
The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, the amazing history and sublime mystery of the Passion, written by Jeanne Constantino, Ph.D. It is my wish that this book will transport you on a journey of discovery, alternating between the dramatic, the informative, the spiritual, and the inspirational. But above all, it is my sincere hope that it will open the world of Christ to you and give you a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the last week in the life of Jesus Christ, leading to a deeper appreciation of his passion that you will never forget. The Crucifixion of the King of Glory.
Now available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook at store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeanne Constantino. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeanne.
Okay, so we're back talking about the seamless robe. So we do know that this is what made it valuable, and this is why they decided not to tear it or cut it, because the robe of Jesus is seamless. And here what we're talking about is the main piece of clothing, which was a tunic that stretched from the neck down to the ankles, and it was long-sleeved. That's the basic garment that was worn by both men and women. So this is the thing that he was wearing after they scourged him. So it's full of blood and it's a mess, etc. So why do they want it? And why did they decide not to tear it, but to gamble for it? Because it was seamless. This made it very, very valuable. So I asked somebody about this. This is one of the things that I was really wanted to understand when I was researching the book. I just heard the promo while I'm talking about the book. I didn't record that. That's why it sounds a little slow to me, but I hope you get the message behind it. I perfectly mean everything that I said there. I hope that the book is informative and also inspiring for you. But one of the things that I wanted to find out was about this seamless robe. How is this possible? Because if you know anything about sewing, you know that you can't really create something that is seamless, all right? But of course, this was woven. But even with weaving, I already mentioned how, of course, all fabric is woven, right? Because you have threads that go up and down, vertically, and then you have threads that go back and forth horizontally. There's a woof and a warp, and there are all kinds of, words for this kind of a thing. So fabric has threads that have to be woven. And even then, so it made it very difficult for me to understand how this was possible, all right? So I asked someone, and she said, that's not possible. But it says it's in the Bible. It has to be possible. So I was able to figure out by my research how this has happened, how this could happen. Well, there were people who knew how to weave something. I just want you to appreciate how difficult this is. How to weave something on a loom that had to weave a garment that even had sleeves, but had no seams. I just want you to picture that. Just picture something simple. A garment with a neck opening, and of course, wide enough at the bottom, at the hem, so that somebody could walk easily, and also had two sleeves for the right arm and the left arm, and yet it had no seams. This would require an expert, all right? And you have to have a special kind of loom. So it would require, there are looms that were constructed so that a garment could be made that had no seams, but it would really require an expert weaver to know how to do this. And I don't want to speculate. I have an opinion, but I'm not going to say, because I don't think that we should speculate about such things. But obviously it was possible because it's in the Bible. We know that Jesus had a seamless robe. we also know it was possible because, and this is the theological importance of it, the high priest, the Jewish high priest, wore a seamless robe. So this is why John, the evangelist John, who is the only one who tells us why and how they gambled for his robe. Okay, he's the one who tells us about this, that they cast lots. The others just tell us that they cast lots for his clothes, but there was one specific garment that they were casting lots for, and it was extremely valuable because it was seamless, and that was the robe. Now, why did Jesus have a seamless robe, and why does John tell us? Jesus ordinarily, didn't own anything fancy or expensive, but there was a lot of significance to the fact that he had a seamless robe. And that's because only the high priest, or at least maybe other people also had, I don't know, maybe other people also had seamless robes, but definitely the high priest wore a seamless robe. And John saw in the fact that Jesus also had a seamless robe, John saw in this Jesus's role as the heavenly high priest. That we, of course, understand the meaning of this because of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament that describes Jesus as the heavenly high priest who sanctifies us, right? So he is not only the one who offered himself as the sacrificial lamb, he is not only the lamb, I should say, who is offered, but he is the one who is doing the offering. You see, he is both the Passover lamb and the great high priest of heaven who is doing the offering. And we see him consecrate himself for the sacrifice the night before he was offered on Thursday night. If you go to church, I hope you will go to church on Holy Thursday night, go in time to hear that first gospel reading, which ends with what we have traditionally called the high priestly prayer of Christ, because Christ prays to the Father for the disciples. First, he gives them, from 3 chapters, three and a half chapters of instructions that we call the farewell discourse in biblical studies. And then in chapter 17 of John's Gospel, he prays to the Father, and he offers himself, and he consecrates himself as the sacrifice. But because this prayer is very priestly in tone, it has traditionally been called the high priestly prayer of the Lord. And of course, he's wearing this garment, which was associated in the Jewish mind with the high priest. So this is why he is offered and he is both the one who is being offered and the one who is doing the offering. And we say this in the prayers of the Divine Liturgy. You are the one who is offered and the offerer. So we say that kind of a thing. So, the book of Hebrews explains Christ's role as the heavenly high priest, and is really a beautiful meditation upon his role as the heavenly high priest. So I won't have time to discuss that any further. In the book of Hebrews, and somebody asked me over the weekend about Christ's sacrifice as atonement, we did discuss this here on Search the Scriptures Live. I can't remember what date it was offered. If you want to look up any of these discussions that we have already had, I'm sure we discussed the idea of atonement, how Christ definitely atones for us with a specifically Orthodox understanding of what that meant. You can look up the lessons on Hebrews where we talked about this. The easiest way to do this is to go to orthodoxbiblestudy.info, and all of the lessons for Search the Scriptures and Search the Scriptures Live are there at that site on one page. They're easy to find. So I'm not trying to take you away from Ancient Faith Radio, But here on Ancient Faith Radio, the lessons are also here, but they're hard to find because there are many podcasts, and then you have to go back and back and back because they only show you so many, podcasts per page. But at orthodoxbiblestudy.info, all of the podcasts are listed, and they're all on one page. You can just go down the page. You can find the place where we have lessons on the book of Hebrews, and then you could listen to any discussion about atonement that you want to hear, okay? Now, let's go on. I'm sorry that I have to deviate to tell you about that, but that's where you're going to find all of these podcasts, thanks to Greg Patrick, who has spent a lot of time. He created that site for me and maintains it for me and for everybody else who wants to find all of these lessons in one place. Thank you, Greg. The two robbers, let's talk about them. Jesus is crucified between two thieves or two robbers. And this, again, was something that was prophesied, that he would do this. And the reason why they wanted Jesus crucified was so that he would be crucified in a disgraceful manner. He would die in disgrace between two thieves. That is not, it was not an accident. He wasn't crucified alone. And not only, he wasn't crucified on the side, but in the middle, between two thieves, that he might share their reputation, the fathers of the church say. So they are described by Matthew and Mark as liste. Listis is the singular for robber, highway robber, a bandit, a criminal. Sometimes the same word was used for an insurrectionist. But here we have two of them. So they are the liste. These were probably, in this case, maybe not violent political revolutionaries. That was Barabbas. Remember, Barabbas is also described in this way. But remember that criminals often were highway robbers. This is how they got money. They would rob people by the side of the road as they were traveling along the road. But in this case, it could also just be somebody who was a thief. All right. So these were either ordinary common thieves, or maybe they were highway bandits. But I want you to remember way back when we started our discussion here, I want you to remember that when the Lord cleansed the temple, he said to the chief priests, "You have made my father's house into a den of robbers." And this is the word that he used. You have made my father's house into a den of thieves, a den of robbers, liste, okay? Now, they have succeeded in getting rid of him, and they have succeeded in associating Jesus with thieves. It's as though they intentionally said, "Oh, you're calling us thieves? You're the one who's going to die like a thief, and we're going to have you crucified between two thieves," so everybody would see who's the real thief here. Of course, they never accused Jesus of being anyone who stole anything, but they wanted him to share the reputation of thieves and to die as somebody cursed by God. That's the reason for the crucifixion. Jesus is now going to suffer the penalty of robbers. He is going to share that label. He's going to be guilty by association. And by the way, as far as most Jews of the first century were concerned, Jesus was a sinner because he died on the cross. This was proof positive that Jesus was cursed by God. Now, kind of interesting, I have to say, maybe not all Jews came to that conclusion, that Jesus was really guilty of something because he died this way. And you know why I think that? Because there is a famous Jew, Flavius Josephus. He is a first century Jewish historian who wrote the history of the Jewish people in a book called Antiquities. And he mentions Jesus. And he mentions James, the brother of the Lord. And he mentions John, the forerunner. So this is a Jewish historian now. He was not a follower of Jesus, but he mentions that Jesus was put to death by the Jewish leaders. And he was he mentions that Jesus was a wonder worker. and a marvelous preacher. So he actually mentions Jesus. So I don't know that that he was somebody who was really great among them. So I don't know that. So you see, the reason why I'm mentioning this is that the Jews of the first century knew how corrupt their leadership was. Josephus himself tells us how corrupt the management of the temple was. The high priests and the chief priests, the extreme corruption, the greed and the corruption of the sacrifices and the sacrificial system are known to us, not from Christian writings, but from Jewish writings. And Josephus is one of the people who directly talks about this. So just because Jesus died on the cross, it seems clear that not all Jews believe that he was guilty of anything. But certainly some of them might have thought this, okay? So at any rate, now Jesus is crucified between two thieves. What else did they do to him on the cross? They mocked him on the cross. And this was part of the process of crucifixion, that a person suffered the humiliation of being publicly mocked. So it's not bad enough that you're suffering physically. The people who are your enemies now come and mock you from the cross. So you're suffering the humiliation and you're suffering this kind of degradation on the cross as they are defenseless. And of course, it was expected. It was part of the humiliation of the cross, and it was on purpose. It was done to add insult and humiliation and gloating. So spectators often derided crucified criminals. Now, of course, most of the time they are really criminals. So the thieves really are criminals. And it was part of as I said, it was to add to the disgrace and their punishment that they had to suffer this way for an extended period of time, the mocking of the crowd. It was also something that was encouraged by the Romans. We don't think like that. When a person has done something wrong and we think that you might deserve it, because they have really done something wrong. Sometimes in our culture, we will say, well, they've suffered enough. Let's say somebody was negligent and their child died. They forgot their child in a hot car, for example. We say, well, they had to suffer the loss of their child. They've suffered enough. Should they go to jail for that? Legally, they should go to jail for that if they were so negligent that they forgot about their child enough so that the child died in a car. Legally speaking, they should go to jail. That's, manslaughter. So it's an unintentional, maybe, involuntary homicide, but still they should probably go to jail. What is our reaction? Well, they probably suffered enough, right? That's what we think. As far as the Romans are concerned, or even the Jews, you've never suffered enough. They want to pile on. They want to add to your physical suffering. They want to add to it by adding emotional suffering. They want to add that public degradation. I want you just to realize how different first century Judaism is from us, how different first century Roman Empire, how different the mentality was from our mentality. Okay? We are much more tenderhearted because of our Christian culture. So even though we have rejected many things about Christianity, so that we can really say today, honestly, we really don't have a Christian culture that dominates this country anymore, that's for sure. Nonetheless, we have this idea that maybe we shouldn't pile on, we shouldn't kick someone while they are down. We shouldn't make them feel worse about themselves. We still have remnants of the Christian culture as part of our psyche, and that is one of them. That was not the case in Rome. In the Roman culture, they encouraged people to humiliate anyone who was sentenced to death. It is part of the punishment, okay? The mocking was part of the punishment. When a slave was sentenced to crucifixion, his fellow slaves were encouraged to mock him or her and deride him. That was part of what they were encouraged to do. That's just the way the culture was, okay? So let's take a look at some of the mocking that was done to Jesus, the things that were said to him, because it's amazing to me that even the chief priests who succeeded in getting Jesus to be crucified, remember that took a while because Pilate was reluctant, even though it was the day before Passover, and Passover was going to start in a matter of hours, not the next day, but that day. Remember, the day was going to start at sunset. Passover was about to start. There's plenty of work to be done at the temple, but the chief priests took time out of their busy day to come to Golgotha, to stand at the foot of the cross and mock Jesus. All right? That's amazing to me. But that's how important it was for them to gloat over him. By the way, these insults and this humiliation of the cross is the reason why most Muslims do not believe that Jesus died by crucifixion. I think I mentioned that last time. Most Muslims do not believe that Jesus died by crucifixion. They believe that Simon of Cyrene was crucified by mistake, okay, or that magically he was transformed by God to look like Jesus so that they crucified him by mistake. The Muslims cannot stand the thought of Jesus being humiliated because they regard him as a prophet. They don't believe he could die on the cross or be humiliated in this manner. Look at how different their idea of Jesus is from us. So what that they regard him as a prophet? They think he's going to come back, by the way, as a warrior and kill people. They believe in the second coming of Jesus. He's going to come back and do vengeance. Look how different their thought of Jesus. They think the Christian understanding of Jesus is weak. They don't like the Christian Jesus. They cannot comprehend the power of Christ through the cross. They cannot comprehend the power of love, the power of the humility of Christ. They cannot comprehend how God loves the world like this. They don't understand it. So they don't believe that Jesus suffered this mocking. So let's talk about it. So the statements which were used to mock Christ are ironic, but so powerful because they are theologically meaningful. The first thing is, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Okay, that's the false charge that was brought against Jesus at his trial, that he threatened to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days. So, of course, he never said that. We mentioned that before. Jesus never threatened to destroy the physical temple and rebuild it in 3 days. It was the Jewish leaders who threatened to destroy him. And he would build up his own temple in 3 days, right? He would be resurrected in 3 days. So they are fulfilling his prophecy, the prophecy that he made. The second taunt is, if you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Now, this is the crime for which Jesus was convicted by the Sanhedrin for claiming to be the Son of God. But who was the first one who said, if you are the Son of God, do this or that? That was Satan. Remember, at the temptation of Jesus, that was the first temptation, if you are the Son of God, because at the baptism, the heavens were opened and the Father's voice was heard. This is my beloved Son, right? So Satan was the one who said first, if you are the Son of God. He challenged Jesus to prove himself by changing the stones into bread or jumping off or by worshiping him or something like this. So, of course, Jesus didn't do that. So he is the Son of God, and this is why he is staying on the cross. The third taunt was, he saved others. He cannot save himself. This is the insult. Now, the word saved there is the word sozo. I save, in Greek, sozo, S-O-Z-O. But sozo is also translated as healed. When Jesus says sometimes your faith has healed you, sometimes it's translated as your faith has healed you, it is the word saved. That's why sometimes it's translated as your faith has saved you. Other times it's your faith has healed you, depending upon how they translated it. So the words sozo, saved, can also mean healed. So this is exactly what he was doing. He's not coming down from the cross. He is saving others. He saved others. He cannot save himself. Of course, he can save himself, but he's choosing not to save himself so that he can save others. Okay, now you should realize that when he said he saved others, he cannot save himself. They're not saying this because they really believed that Jesus saved anybody or healed anybody. I want you to realize that. This is sarcastic. Oh, yeah, he really saved others. He saved others. He can't even save himself. That's really what they meant. When I was younger, I never understood this. Okay? Why would they crucify him if they thought he really did save others? It's because they did not believe he saved others. Remember that the chief priests and other Jewish leaders did not believe that Jesus was capable of healing anybody. They believed that he did these things with the power of the devil or by trickery. And that's still in the Talmud. This is still what Jews believe today. Jesus never really healed anybody. It was because he had the power of the devil. He was a sorcerer. He was a trickster. He practiced black magic, you see? So they're not acknowledging that Jesus saved or healed anybody. They believed that he couldn't, and that the very fact that he did not come down from the cross was proof that he never healed anybody. You see the point? That's why they are saying this. They want the whole crowd around them to believe that Jesus never actually healed anyone. You see, that's what's behind that statement. But there's even more to it. His very name, Jesus in Greek, Jesus, in Hebrew, Yeshua, means God saves, Yahweh saves. Yeshua, the Yahshua, means God saves. That's his name. That's why both Mary and Joseph were told to name him Jesus. Call him Yeshua. God saves, because he will save his people from their sins. So, of course, that's what he was doing on the cross. That's why he came, to save us. The fourth taunt is, he is the King of Israel. Hear the sarcasm in that. Let him come down from the cross and we will believe him. He trusted in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him, for he said, I am the Son of God. So this taunt is also, is actually the political charge for which Jesus was crucified, being the King of the Jews. But then there's this other part of it. He trusted in God. Let God deliver him if he delights in him. And this, of course, was a prophecy, right? That they would say this. But the very purpose of the Lord, again, look at the sarcasm, but it's ironic. It's exquisitely ironic. His very purpose was to deliver us. So he was not going to deliver himself. He was not going to save himself, because his whole purpose in coming, not just coming to the cross, but the whole purpose of the incarnation was to save us, to deliver us from the slavery of sin and death. And that is the delight of the Father. The Father did delight in this moment of the Son, because the Son chose to die for us, right? The Son fulfilled the plan of salvation. And even though everybody was mocking him and taunting him, this was part not only of a prophecy, but it was something that he accepted for our sake, even though he had done nothing wrong. And the fact that he was willing to suffer for us and suffer this injustice is the very reason why we are supposed to suffer silently and not respond when we are ill-treated. You remember, did you see the movie, Man of God? How did St. Nectarios behave? He prayed a lot, of course, and he asked God why. And he wrote to his spiritual father the patriarch of Alexandria, that they convinced the patriarch that he had been disloyal, and it was his spiritual father. Heartbreaking. I can't even begin to imagine that pain. But his spiritual father rejected, didn't even respond to his letters. But the point is, the only time, this was shown also in the movie, that he defended anybody was the nuns. He defended the nuns. And he was asked, why won't you defend yourself, but you're defending them? Because he defended people who were wrongly accused, but himself he did not defend. So this is what we do. We're supposed to suffer in silence and not defend ourselves. This is very difficult to do. But this is what makes him a saint. But if we wish to be saints, we also do not defend ourselves, but are willing to suffer wrongs and not defend ourselves. So there you go. We're at the top of the hour, so let's take a moment and pause. When we come back, we will talk about the darkness on the day Christ died, and then we'll turn to some of the last words of the Lord. So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantino will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronema. Dr. Jeanne Constantino brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronema is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronema is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeanne Constantino. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeanne.
Okay, so we haven't gotten to the final words. We're still talking about some events that took place on the cross. I thought it was kind of important for us to talk about them, because you're definitely going to hear about this in a couple of weeks when we get to Holy Week. I want to talk about the darkness that took place on the day Christ died. And this is one of the most extraordinary details, I think, of the death of Christ. And it is something that seems to have captured the imagination of Eric Metaxas, if you've seen any of the interviews or heard any of the podcast interviews that he did with me. He's very fascinated by this because I think it's quite important that we talk about it. I discuss it extensively in the book. I don't want to get into too much detail. I just want to say the following. First of all, it was not an eclipse. Please stop saying it was an eclipse. If you do say that it is an eclipse, it was not an eclipse. And I prove to you why that is the case. How do we know that it was not an eclipse? And I will give you a couple of reasons why. First of all, we know it was not an eclipse because it could not be an eclipse for the following reason. First of all, that Passover, which we know that Jesus was crucified at Passover time. Passover takes place during a full moon, not a new moon. An eclipse, a solar eclipse, which is what we're talking about here, a full, complete solar eclipse, can only take place during a new moon. So, remember back when you studied about the solar system. A new moon is when you have the sun and then the moon and then the earth. The moon is between the sun and the earth. Now, when the moon and the sun perfectly align, then the moon blocks out the rays of the sun. And that's what makes an eclipse. That's a new moon. That can only happen in a new moon. An eclipse can only happen when there's a new moon, when the moon is between the sun and the earth so that it blocks the rays of the sun. But a full moon is the opposite period in the moon cycle. That's when the moon is behind the earth. And the order is you have the sun shining on the earth, and then the moon is behind the earth. It's fully illuminated, but it's behind the earth. Well, it can't create an eclipse when there's a full moon because it's behind the earth. It's not in between the sun and the earth. You see my point? So that's impossible. That's one reason why this was not an eclipse. The second reason why this was not an eclipse, because it lasted for 3 hours. Eclipses, even a total solar eclipse, doesn't take 3 hours. Okay? The longest eclipse on record, I think, is 12 and a half minutes, and that's according to NASA. And this is in the footnotes of the book. So a third reason, we know when eclipses have taken place in the past, and we know when they will take place in the future. You know this because they predicted. Science predicts this all the time. The next time there will be a solar eclipse in this part of the world will be, and then they tell you that there's going to be a lunar eclipse. We know all of this because the planets and comets and the solar system and all these things, the moon, they're very predictable. They're always following the same pattern. And scientists are able to calculate going forward, when is the next time Halley's Comet, for example, will appear? When is the next time that there will be a complete solar eclipse in this hemisphere? Or maybe you're only going to see part of the eclipse where you live. We know all of those things. So, and believe me, back in antiquity, people knew that too. That's why the evangelists do not use the word eclipse. They knew what an eclipse was, okay? And they knew the word eclipse. And they didn't call it an eclipse because it wasn't an eclipse. They just say there was darkness over all the earth from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. Okay, the period of time that Jesus was on the cross from 12 noon to 3 p.m. Okay, so we know this was not an eclipse. And we can also go back in time, and you can go if I invite you to do so, go to the NASA website where it lists all the eclipses going back to the period to the time of Christ, or I can't remember how far back they go, but I looked at their tables, and they say where and when, which years eclipses took place, whether they were total or partial, and what part of the earth they affected. So there was no eclipse during this period of time in the Middle East during the years in which Jesus was having his ministry. Okay, so that's off the table. That we know that didn't happen. So this was an unnatural darkness. Now, because this was an unnatural darkness, we cannot explain it as an eclipse. An eclipse is a natural occurrence, right? An eclipse, by the way, even if it had been an eclipse, that would have been considered a portent or an omen by ancient peoples. That was a big deal to ancient people. And that would have been recorded by the evangelists as a portent, as a sign of divine, displeasure or something like that. They didn't describe it as an eclipse because it wasn't an eclipse. We know, historically speaking, with absolute certainty, it was not an eclipse. And yet the Gospels talk about this darkness. Well, guess what? There was an ancient Greek historian, who lived and wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean about 20 years after the time of Christ, around the year 55. And his name was Thalos. We know he existed, and we know he wrote this book. Unfortunately, the book about the ancient history of the ancient Mediterranean from antiquity, I can't remember when, I'm not sure if we know how far back he went, to the present day, which included his own lifetime. He mentions this unnatural darkness, this darkness that took place. Oh, wait a minute. He didn't call it unnatural. He mentions this darkness that took place, and he calls it an eclipse. Now, he says the reason why he talks about this is he was trying to refute the Christians who talked about the divinity of Jesus Christ, and they mentioned this inexplicable darkness that took place, that covered the world at the when Jesus Christ was dying on the cross. Okay, so Thalos, this pagan, he's a Greek, but he's a pagan. He is responding to Christian claims, and he says, no, it was just an eclipse. It's no proof that Jesus was the Son of God. Christians were pointing to that, obviously. Now think about this. He was alive when this took place, and he was mentioning something that was recent history, and everybody knew about it because people had lived through this. Now, his writing, this history that he wrote, has not survived, but a church father whose name is Julius Africanus wrote about around the year 200 to refute Thalos and say, no, it was not an eclipse, even though Julius did not live through the darkness because he was writing a couple hundred years later after Thalos. He looked it up. He's Julius Africanus. He's a Greek author, okay? But he looked it up in the astronomical records. He said, I checked the records and there was no eclipse that year, okay? So people kept track of these things. People were tremendous astronomers. The ancient Greeks and the Egyptians, the ancient people, the Babylonians, knew very well the stars and the comets and the different constellations because they paid a lot of attention to these things and they kept records of these things. And Julius Africanus says, I looked it up and there was no eclipse. So it was an unnatural darkness. Now, Julius's history and his response was also not preserved, but it was preserved by a Byzantine historian, okay, George Synkelos. So we have indirect evidence that there was a darkness. And then there was another Greek historian who wrote and mentioned this unnatural darkness. He also called it an eclipse. His name was Phlegon. He wrote during the reign of Hadrian. So he was not an eyewitness to these things. But Phlegon also mentions the darkness, and he also mentions the earthquake. He says, listen to this, it was so dark that stars were seen in the sky. That's amazing. Now, he is also a pagan. He wasn't writing to, and he gives us the exact year, by the way, the exact year, which corresponds with the year that Christ died. Okay? This is not a coincidence, my dear friends. This is proof. And this is something that this is mentioned by Origen. I think Origen mentions Phlegon, and can't recall if Origen mentions Thalos, but Jerome, the church father, also mentions these people. These writings were still in existence when these early church writers were defending Christian claims about Jesus Christ. So even though those writings don't exist now, we know what they said because their words were preserved by other authors later who were refuting these guys, okay? So most of the writings of antiquity have not survived until today. But we know what they said because when those writings were still in existence, Christians responded to them. So we know what they said, all right? So it doesn't matter that they don't exist today. There is absolute proof that there was a darkness on the day Christ died. And now, what do we see today? We see highly intelligent, very fancy, schmancy people with lots of degrees who teach biblical studies at universities who say, oh, no, this was a symbolic darkness. This was just an apocalyptic exaggeration. It was just Matthew trying to, express the fact that the world was plunged into sin and darkness, the divine displeasure, all these other things. No, there was an actual historical darkness on the day when Christ died. Okay? We know that for a fact. Okay? So anyway, I can't spend more time on this, but there's plenty of documentation of this in the book if you care to know. So unfortunately, we're just getting to our primary subject, which was the last words of Christ. And we have 15 minutes left. We're going to go a little bit over our podcast, because I think it's so important that we talk about the last words. So, and our engineer for tonight, Matushka Trudy, thank you, Trudy, for agreeing to stay late so that we can talk about the 7 last words of Christ on the cross. Again, I'm only going to tell you a few things about it, and there are more things that I could say, and also these beautiful patristic statements about the meaning of these final words of our Lord on the cross. But you're going to have to look at the book for that. So we're going to start with the one that's the most confusing to people, the most misunderstood, and that is the words, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? It is amazing to me that we still have Christians who do not understand that Jesus was quoting Psalm 22, or Psalm 21, if you're going to use the Septuagint numbering. This, by the way, the statements of the Lord, are 7 that are preserved. No gospel has all 7. Luke has 3 sayings, John has 3 other sayings, and Matthew and Mark have just this one. And no gospel feels a need to tell us everything that happened, and no gospel tells us all of the things that the Lord said. They choose to say, to highlight certain things. So Matthew and Mark highlight this saying of the Lord, and they did not feel the need to explain to the reader that Jesus was not saying that he felt that the Father abandoned him. They didn't explain what Jesus meant because they figured that everybody understood it. So if we don't understand it, that's our fault. That's because we are far away from the tradition of the early church. Until the Middle Ages, there were no chapter numbers in the Bible. That was added hundreds of years later, and then even later after that, verses were added. But when the Psalms were written down, when people like John Chrysostom and St. Basil and others were reading from their Bible, they had no chapter numbers. The Psalms were not numbered. That happened later. So when Jesus was alive, the Psalms had no numbers. So when they would go to the synagogue and they would pray, nobody stood up and said, let's all sing Psalm 22. They would say, let's all sing, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Psalms were the Jewish psalter. They were the Jewish hymnal. Everybody knew these songs by heart. The way you know, Soson Kyrie Tolon, so save, O Lord, thy people, or you know, Christos Anesti, Christ is risen, or if you come from a Protestant tradition, you know, I don't know, what a friend we have in Jesus, or whatever those hymns are. It's always the first line of the hymn. Onward Christian Soldiers. I don't know the names of too many Protestant hymns, but I know that the title is the first line. Okay? Before they might be different numbers in a hymnal, but people know them by the title, right? Well, it's the same thing with the Psalms. People knew that Psalms by the title, which was always the first line of the hymn. So, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He doesn't believe that God has forsaken him. That's ridiculous. He had made his peace at the Garden of Gethsemane. He did not want to die. That was a perfectly natural human reaction, which I discuss in the book. And the fathers of the church say there's nothing shameful about that. Human beings do not want to die. We don't want to suffer. Even though he was God, fully God, yes, he was fully human, and he liked his life. None of us usually is hoping to die unless we're suffering a lot. We enjoy this life. And the world is beautiful, and we have our loved ones and our family and our friends and the blue sky. Most of the time, we like our life, and we want to stay alive. It is a natural part of our creatureliness to want to preserve our life. That's normal. And Jesus was fully human and did not wish to die. So we've already talked about this. So he didn't suddenly change his mind and feel like God had abandoned him. He was not experiencing alienation from God because of sin. Somebody sent me something. If you're listening to me now and you remember sending me something perfectly horrible, I should have put this in the book. They read something that a Protestant minister had said about why Jesus said this, and it was absolutely horrific, that he was experiencing the wrath of God on the cross or something awful. No, he was not experiencing all of God's wrath directed toward humanity that was now being poured out on the Son of God, and this is why he said it. No, this is horrible. God was not wrathful toward humanity. He was not wrathful toward his own son. Okay? Although if you have that kind of idea of what the cross is, I suppose that would be your conclusion. But no, it sounds logical to people who have that idea, but that's really heresy. Why would God be pouring out his wrath on the Son? No, this is not what he was experiencing. He is quoting the psalm. Maybe he was praying it himself. Okay, or maybe he was calling upon the people around him to remember the psalm and pray it themselves. Okay, because that psalm is prophetic. And there are many verses in that psalm which mimic or recall the scene at the cross, including they have that they were mocking him. He committed his cause to the Lord. Let him deliver him if he delights in him. They have pierced my hands and my feet, etc. So there were many things. The gambling for his clothes, that all who see me mock me and they jeer at me, and they are gambling for his clothes, this kind of a thing. Okay, well, but at the end of the psalm, the last third of the psalm is different. The last 1/3 of the psalm expresses the fact that this person who is in distress, who is in trouble, is actually going to be victorious. Okay? So the first 2/3 of the psalm are terrible. The person is in awful distress. But now, with the last third of the psalm or so remaining, the tone changes completely. And all of a sudden it says, I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. It changes to a psalm of glorification and of vindication. It says, I will stand in the midst of the congregation. That's the word ecclesia. I will stand in the middle of the church and I will praise the Lord. And he talks about how he knows that God has heard him when he cried out to him, that he will be vindicated. And listen to this, how it ends. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. Everybody's going to turn to the Lord because of what is happening at the moment on the cross. The families of the nations, that's the Gentiles, will worship before him. Men will tell of the Lord to the coming generations. In other words, because of what's happening on the cross, the nations, remember, that's the Gentiles, will come to the Lord and they will talk about this. And they will proclaim the Lord's deliverance to a people unborn. In the future generations, they will talk about how their deliverance came through this moment. God has brought deliverance from the cross. You see that? It is so unbelievably powerful. The Lord was sending a message to us. He was not telling us that God had abandoned him or forgotten him or that he was experiencing the weight of sin or anything like that, even though we can say that, yes, he died for our sins and the pain that he experienced was real. And yes, it was because we sinned. That's for sure. But he was not experiencing any sense of alienation from God. He cannot. Because as God, as the Son of God, as a member of the Trinity, we can never say that somehow the Son was separated from the Father. That would be heresy. He says the Father and I are one, right? I am in the Father and the Father is in me. There is an indwelling of the persons of the Trinity. So he can never be alienated from the Father, right? You see, so we have to be very careful about these things which sound very, logical on some sense, on some level, but they're completely wrong. So this psalm is fulfillment of prophecy to the utmost degree. Whenever you read some prophecy in one of the Gospels or Acts, go back and read the whole thing. If you read this whole thing, this whole psalm, you will understand that Matthew and Mark are trying to tell us what it means. It's not that Jesus felt that God had abandoned him, okay? So I regret the fact that Christians still don't understand that, but I guess the word hasn't gone out. The first Christians did, okay? We don't. All right, another thing. This is in the Gospel of Luke. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. So here again, we see that the character of the Lord and the purpose of the cross was forgiveness of humanity. And while Muslims don't understand why he would ever say this, the first Christians understood it. And he was followed in this by so many thousands of martyrs who died for the Lord, like Saint Stephen, the proto-martyr, who asked the Lord to forgive this. Lord, do not hold this sin against him, as they were stoning him to death. The purpose of the cross was the salvation of the world. So, of course, he's not asking the Father to get vengeance against them. God forbid. He wants them to be saved. That's why he was dying for them. So even while he was dying on the cross, he asked for their salvation, for the forgiveness of his persecutors. He's not asking for divine retribution. And this is the purpose why he was, Chrysostom said, there's nothing so more powerful than this. Chrysostom says, this is how we ought to love God. If we really love God, we need to forgive our enemies. This is what it means to love God. So if there's anyone in your life whom you haven't forgiven, you must forgive them. I don't want to hear any excuses. I don't remember if I told you this or not, but one of my friends who's a priest asked me to preach at his church once. He asked me to preach at his church. When I went there, Father was substituting there at his parish once. And it just so happened that the gospel reading that day was of the unforgiving debtor. And he said, I want you to, the priest, he knew he wasn't there. Father preached one Sunday, I preached the next Sunday. And I knew that in this parish, because I knew the priest very well, I knew that they were arguing and the parish was divided. And so I said, well, this was the Sunday of the unforgiving debtor. Remember the story about the parable that the Lord told about how there was a man who owed a huge sum of money to his master, like millions of dollars, which he couldn't possibly repay. And then he was also owed a small sum by a fellow servant. And the master, he felt, was going to sell him into slavery. And he begged, and the master forgave the debt. But this servant was unwilling to forgive the relatively small sum of money that he was owed by his fellow servant. And this parable is called the parable of the unforgiving debtor. It's in the Gospel of Matthew. So I preached this sermon about how we are obligated, if we wish to be forgiven by God. This is an absolute obligation. And we say this every time we say the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgive our trespasses. And if the implication is, if we do not forgive everyone, the Lord will not forgive us. So I preached this rather, you can imagine, fiery sermon about this. Okay? And afterwards, I was dumbfounded to be approached in the coffee hour by people said, but Presbytera, you don't understand what they did to us. You don't understand. In other words, I didn't change, I think, a single mind at that church. I was rather dismayed by that. But that's the truth. It's not my words. It's Jesus's words. And now he lives it. He said, we have to forgive everyone who hurt us. And if we do not, we will not be forgiven. That's categorical. And he gave us the example. Nobody has hurt us, any of us, the way the Lord was hurt. None of us has been crucified. None of us has been tortured to death. Okay? So if you're listening to this and somebody hurt your feelings or did something to harm you, and you are still holding on to that, you better find a way to forgive them. And if no other way, because the Lord gave you this example, this is why he gave us this example, so that we can see the Lord never asked us to do anything that he did not do himself. Countless Christian martyrs were tortured to death, and they forgave their persecutors. They asked the Lord not to hold this sin against them. I want to tell you about something else. I read some ridiculous scholar who said about Christian martyrs that they probably died cursing the Romans. And I thought, you obviously have not read any account of Christian martyrdom. They did not die cursing the Romans. They considered the devil responsible. They didn't hold the Romans responsible. They pitied the Romans. They did. There's so many accounts of martyrdom that we have. They pitied the Romans for putting them to death. They didn't curse them. They've always held the devil. That's why we can never, when somebody hurts us, we should never blame that person. That person is a victim of the evil one, and we have to forgive them. Okay? So the Lord gave us this example. What a sublime example. My gosh. My goodness. I mean, this is why we say on Holy Week, when we hear these gospel readings again and again and again, the behavior of the Lord, the pity that he has for Judas. Judas, you would betray me with a kiss. Judas, Chrysostom says, is as if he is bemoaning the loss of Judas's soul, that he says his name, Judas. How could you do this, Judas? Not thinking of himself, but of thinking of Judas's soul, knowing what was going to happen. And now he says, Father, forgive them. He's dying by torture, the worst form of death ever devised. And he forgives them. If Jesus can do this, who is God, who was sinless, who never did anything to deserve this, and we have done a lot of things to deserve the suffering in our life, you cannot bring yourself to forgive someone, or I will challenge you on something further. Maybe you think you have forgiven everyone, but when you hear that person's name, or when you remember what they did to you, if it still bothers you, and you get upset when you think about it, I'm telling you, you have not fully forgiven that person, and you need to work on that. I know, because that happened to me. I would say, yeah, I forgave them, but whenever I would think back about that, it still bothered me. And I said, you know what? I think that there's a remnant, something in there inside of me. I know I haven't fully forgiven them. So you need to take care of that. Okay? So work on that. That's your assignment before Pascha. As soon as possible, go to confession. Okay? So another statement of the Lord from the Gospel of Luke, unique to the Gospel of Luke. Today you will be with me in paradise. Here again. Now the Lord and it gives us another example of forgiveness, but here he is forgiving the repentant thief. So this is a story we have only in the Gospel of Luke. It's part of Luke's themes. He alone emphasizes this character of the Lord, this mission of the Lord to forgive others. And so we have the first two thieves. It's amazing. It's an amazing story. Initially, both thieves were criticizing the Lord. Think about it. Can you imagine? Now, the first thief, only Luke tells us that one of them had a change of heart. The first thief was saying, aren't you the Christ? Think about that. The first thief is saying, aren't you the Christ, the Messiah? Save yourself and us. The first thief actually thought he was the Messiah. He was calling on the Lord to save them. That's amazing. But the second thief said, what do you mean? Why are you saying this? This man has done nothing wrong. We deserve what we are suffering. So the second thief, the repentant thief, recognized and confessed that they had done something wrong to deserve their fate. And then he asks the Lord to remember him. He tried to correct his brother thief. And then he confessed that he had done the wrong thing and was deserving his fate. And then he turned to the Lord and said, Jesus, remember me in your kingdom. Nisiti mokiria and vasiliasu. Remember me in your kingdom. So this is something that we know. And we remember the repentant thief. He's very important in the Orthodox tradition because the Lord said, today you will be with me in paradise. And wow, what a reward. Okay? So, of course, the fathers of the church talk about this. And Chrysostom talks about confession. He confessed. And then he asked the Lord to remember him. And because he confessed, because he not only acknowledged who Jesus was, the first thief acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah, but he looked beyond that and recognized the kingdom. And he confessed his own sin. And because of this, and he asked the Lord to remember him, because of this, he entered paradise before anyone else. He hadn't witnessed any of the miracles. He's not like the apostles, who Jesus gave promises to the apostles that they would sit on the 12 thrones judging Israel. They saw many miracles, but this thief saw nothing. But somehow, and Chrysostom thinks it's because of the darkness and the other things that he realized who Jesus was, that he changed and he repented and he asked the Lord to remember him. He confessed and repented. So he saw all of these things with the eyes of faith. Now listen to what Chrysostom says. Do you see that he saw with the eyes of faith? This was irrational. So when we require that everything conform to human reasoning, look at what we're missing. It's irrational to look at a crucified person, somebody who is being crucified along with yourself. He's bloodied and battered and spat upon and beaten. And you look at him and you say, remember me in your kingdom? That's illogical. What kingdom? He's on the cross, for God's sake. And you look at this barely recognizable human being and you say, remember me in your kingdom? That was a divine insight that he had, that he suddenly recognized who Christ was and asked him to remember him. So St. John Chrysostom said, do you see that he saw with the eyes of faith? He was not scrutinizing visible things. The next time you are tempted to insist upon proof, upon visible things, upon the things of this world to make sense of your faith, think about the repentant thief on the cross. I'm continuing here with Chrysostom. Because he was not scrutinizing visible things, for this reason God was not scrutinizing his bare words, but just as he saw the divinity within, God saw the bandit's heart within and says, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, St. John Chrysostom makes another contrast. He says, Adam lost paradise because of one misdeed, right? He ate the fruit. He disobeyed God because of one thing. But Christ brought in this thief who was guilty of many, many sins because of one moment. From one moment, we can change from one thing to the next. We can change our eternal destiny if we confess and if we repent. Okay? It is not only his words, but also his heart. This is why So it's never too late, dear brothers and sisters. It's never too late to change the outcome of your life. And this is why also we're not supposed to ever judge anyone, because we don't know. Even if we see someone sin, this is from St. Simeon, the new theologian. Remember this. Even if we actually see someone sin, maybe some terrible sin, we never judge them, because we don't know how hard they fought against the sin and how much they may have repented for it later. Those are the words of St. Simeon, the new theologian. We never are to judge anyone for their sin, even if we're confident we know for a fact. So people say to me, I know for a fact, Presbyterian, that this person did thus and such. I don't want to hear about it. Don't judge them. Look at yourself. Look to yourself. We don't judge people for two reasons. St. Simeon, the new theologian, said, because we don't know how hard they fought against the sin before succumbing to it. And secondly, we don't know the extent to which they may have repented. And maybe God forgave that person and you're still thinking about their sin. Well, guess what? Look at your own life. Okay? That's why we don't do that. And this is another reason, because we see this sudden change of the repentant thief. For this reason, we never stop praying for people. We never give up on them. There may be somebody that you wish they would change their life, and you feel like it's never going to happen because you've been praying and praying and praying for years for this person, and you don't see any change. You don't know at what moment they might be changed. This is why we never stop praying for people, you see, that we care about. Okay, that's why. So we should never lose hope of our own salvation or of anyone else's salvation. So we should always remember this, and we do remember this in a moment the thief was saved, in just one moment. That's why it's never too late for us to change. Never, no matter what we have done. Another word of the Lord on the cross, woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. So, of course, it has often been said by some Christians, especially Protestant Christians, that Jesus' mother was not very special, not very important, and he didn't have very much regard for her because at the wedding at Cana, he called her woman. Woman, what have you to do with me? When she asked him to change the water, to do something about the fact that they had run out of wine. We see here and in other places in the Gospel of John that Jesus had a habit of addressing women as woman. And as a matter of fact, it was a term of endearment for him. By calling his mother woman, he was not showing disrespect toward her. It was a term of endearment. And the most obvious place where we see this is here when he's dying on the cross. He says, woman, behold your son. Clearly, he's not being disrespectful. He's worried about his mother. He knew that she, as a childless, soon-to-be childless widow, would have no one to take care of her. So he gives her over to the care of the apostle and evangelist, John. So he loved his mother, and there are beautiful things that St. John Chrysostom and other fathers say about this moment when he's dying and he's concerned about his mother. And we know that the evangelist John tells us that she went to live with him from that very hour, and that she lived with John until the time of her death. So this is an obligation for us to take care of our elderly parents as long as they are no obstacle to us, St. John Chrysostom says. But we have to remember that we owe this to our parents, to care for them in their old age. I thirst. This is from the Gospel of John. So, of course, the Lord had a thirst, a real thirst, and this was common. Probably he was very dehydrated. And I explained to you in this, in the book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, how he would have become dehydrated from being without any sort of liquids by the beatings that he received, by the sweating that he went through. But I also described what this type of dehydration was like. It was not like, we all know what it is to be thirsty. He was beyond that stage, probably. But I do want to take a minute. You can read about that And I think we should. We don't want to be reminded of the suffering of the Lord, but I think it's very important that we are. And I want to take a minute here. I'm not going to talk about that, but I'll talk about the difference between the wine that was offered to him at the beginning and the vinegary wine that was offered at the end. Because I was always confused by this myself. Finally, through this book, got to understand it. So when you go to church for Holy Week and you're listening to these Gospels read, you'll hear them say that they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. That's Matthew. Or wine to drink mixed with myrrh, and that's in Mark. And after tasting it, he would not drink it, okay, or he refused to drink it. That's early in the crucifixion process. When they first got to the site of crucifixion, there were Jewish women who considered it an act of mercy, who would offer condemned criminals a kind of wine with a kind of substance that was intended to help dull the pain. And gall is the general Greek word for anything that's bitter. And these, of course, were medicinal substances, many, many different kinds of medicinal substances that could help, choli in Greek, and then miron and myrrh in Matthew. Myrrh is actually tree resin, but that had a kind of medicinal property. There were resins and also like saps from various types of plants. Or gall. Gall was the word that's used for any bitter substance that was added to wine. And there were people were very familiar with plants. Remember, they didn't have chemical compounds like we have today to use medicinally. Everything was done by plants. And there were plants, the extracts of which were used to alleviate pain. And there were Jewish women who considered this their sort of act of philanthropy. And they would go and offer this kind of wine to condemned criminals. Jesus refuses this. The Hebrew word for gall is the Hebrew word rosh, which also means head. Like Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the head of the new year, or the Hebrew word for the new year. The Jewish new year is Rosh Hashanah. You probably know that. Rosh means head, okay, the first of the year. But the word head was a shortened word for the head of a poppy plant. So poppy plants are grown in, Iraq and Iran today. That's where opium comes from. That's where heroin comes from. And people knew these substances as sedatives, and they knew how to use them. And people knew how to produce opium and other types of opiates in the Roman Empire. And they actually were capable of putting people to sleep and performing surgery. The Romans and the Greeks knew how to do this. We know this from Roman medical records. So they couldn't administer it with the kind of precision that modern anesthesiologists are able to do to put you to sleep for so long and then wake you up. They couldn't do that, but they could put people to sleep and then actually perform complex surgeries. And because of this, they also had sponges soaked in mandrake wine. They were able to give people substances to smell, and they would put people to sleep. So because they knew about this is the reason why the soldier pierced the side of Christ. We're going to talk about that later. But this is why, to make sure he was dead, because somebody could have given Jesus a sedative to make it look like he was dead, but he was really only unconscious. You see, that they had given him something to make it appear that he was dead. You see, that's why he wanted to make sure. They were trained to how to pierce somebody's heart or pierce their lungs to make sure that they were dead, because this was something that was very well known. So the soldiers were trained how to pierce somebody, exactly where to put the spear, to make sure that if they were only asleep from a sedative, that they would not This would give them the death blow. You see, they would not wake up from it. So that's the wine. This is different from the bowl of vinegar that is described in John's gospel, that when Jesus says, I thirst, they give him something and he receives it. You see the difference? When Jesus tastes the wine with the gall, he doesn't want to have anything to do with that. Jesus refused to accept any painkiller. Okay? Now, how much would it have dulled the pain? I don't know. Probably not much, but it was something, right? He refuses anything that would dull any of the pain. He accepts all of the pain of the cross for our sake. But at the very end, when he says, I thirst, they give him this thing, this other thing, which is not exactly vinegar, not exactly wine. That's why it's usually rendered as vinegar, but people don't drink vinegar. This is a kind of vinegary wine. In other words, it's a cheap wine. It was the wine of the poor, and in Latin it was called Posca, and in Greek it's oxos, O-X-O-S. Okay, it is a wine actually, but it's a cheap wine. That's why it's sometimes translated as vinegar, to distinguish it from inos. O-I-N-O-S is the Greek word for wine. So it wasn't good. It was cheap wine, and it was designed to quench your thirst. Okay, it's not water, because water can go bad, or water is sort of untrustworthy, whether you could get sick from water back in those days. So the Roman soldiers would drink this cheap wine. So there was a bowl of vinegar. That's one of the things that perplexed me. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. It seems so strange to us. Why is there this random bowl of vinegar at a site of execution? Well, it's there because the soldiers would get thirsty, so they wanted to have something to drink. So yeah, there's a bowl of vinegar there that they were drinking from. So they take a sponge, they soak it in this vinegar, and they give it to Jesus to drink. You see? But it's what they were drinking. All right? So that's what is meant by the I thirst. For more details, you have to get the book. I'm sorry, folks, but we're kind of running out of time, and I'm keeping Trudy past the time of this. So there's two more things to talk about. It's the words it is finished. Now, when he says it is finished, he's not just saying, I'm done with my suffering on the cross. This means much more than that. He says it is finished. It's just one word in Greek, tetelestai. With one word, he expresses the fact that with his death, the entire plan of salvation, which the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit put into action before the creation of the world, has come to an end, has come to its completion. Of course, he still has to rise from the dead. There's no question about that. But that's the plan of salvation is completed with this one word, tetelestai. And Jesus often refers to his work, that he has come to accomplish this work. In the Gospel of John, the words "it is finished," tetelestai, can be translated as "it is completed" or "it is accomplished." And in the Gospel of John, where this saying of the Lord is from, the Lord said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish, delioso, his word." Okay, it's the same thing. Okay, so he with this one word, he says he's accomplished what the Lord, with the Father, sent him to do. And then, of course, he allows himself to die. And the Gospels say that Jesus cried out with a loud voice and said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And Luke tells us this. Only Luke tells us the words. Now, Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus cried out with a loud voice and then died. Now, why do they describe it like this? He doesn't just scream. He doesn't scream, "Ah!" and die. He cries out and he says this. Luke tells us exactly what he said. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Now, why the crying out? Because the fathers say, we want you to understand. Jesus wants us to understand that he died with power. Why is that important? His life did not slowly ebb away. He died under his own terms. He died when he decided to die. Okay? So that's what it means when it says, it is finished. He lowered his head, and then he died. Okay? He lowered his head, then he died. Now, in the movies, what they show you is Jesus saying, it is finished. He dies, and then his head falls forward. That's a mistake. It doesn't say that in the Gospel of John. He says, it is finished. Then he lowered his head, and then he died. The reason why that's important is that Jesus his head doesn't fall forward after he dies. He lowers his head, and then he dies. That means he was in control of his own death. We don't control our death, but he, as God, and as the only sinless human who ever died, was in control of his death. He died at the time that he was ready to die. So he says, into your hands I give my spirit. The word spirit means breath and life. Okay? So he gives up his life when he is ready to give up his life, and not a moment before. Okay? So I thank you for staying on with me to the very end, even though we went a long time over, half an hour, almost half an hour over. And I want to tell you that next week, on April 11th, we will talk about what happened at the moment the Lord died, and that's the tearing of the curtain. Wow, that's really fascinating. And the piercing, and all that, although that sounds kind of boring because you think you know all about the piercing, there's something amazing about the piercing that you do not know. Okay? And I think we're going to talk about Jesus as the Messiah, the two kinds of Messiah. There are two Messiahs that I don't know how far we'll get, of course. I think we'll talk about the two kinds of Messiahs that the Jews believed in and still believe in, and how Jesus is the one perfect Messiah that fulfilled all of those prophecies. Okay, so that's going to be April 11th. April 18th, there's no program because, as you know, it's Holy Monday, and we'll all be getting ready for Pascha. So at any rate, we have next Monday to look forward to get you all ready for Holy Week. And thank you for listening, even though I went over tonight. And now let's close with our prayer. Thank you, Trudy, for letting me keep you a bit later tonight. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word. For our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.